So the topic of my literature review was prison overcrowding in the United States. A little introduction is that we all kind of know that prison overcrowding is a serious issue that's happening in our country, and it has been happening for several years now. There's a number of possible reasons for the overcrowding, and my literature review focuses on mostly like what exactly prison overcrowding is, how bad it is, and reasons it started happening, and then also how it affects the people in our country. My literature review covers 10 topics of research. The first has to do with prison populations. Just kind of discusses just how severe of an issue prison overcrowding is right now in our country. The next is the origins of overcrowded prisons, and this is going back to like the late 60s, early 70s, when a lot of laws were implicated that really started the ball rolling with the overcrowded prisons. In the 70s to the 80s, prison populations began doubling very quickly, and now they're just way bigger than they ever were back then. The drug offenses section talks about how a huge population of our prison population is non-violent drug offenders, and just how strictly a lot of them are punished for their crimes. Then next talked about racial issues. A lot of crimes are specifically committed mostly by minorities, and then these crimes specifically are also punished more severely than others. So there's always an issue that's coming up with overcrowded prisons, and also minorities make up a huge percentage of the overcrowded prisons that we have. The three strike laws, that basically is how if someone commits their third felony, it's the third strike and they're out, and they are going to go to prison for a very long time. And since this law was put into place, the overcrowded prison problem has just increased dramatically, and a lot of people think that is one of the main reasons. The number 6 was mandatory minimums. In this case, it kind of takes parole out of the question for a lot of prisoners, because their mandatory minimum to their maximum sentence served in prison is only like 1 day difference, so they're going to be in prison their entire sentence, and that just kind of takes parole out of the picture. And again, that just adds to the overcrowded prisons that we have. Funding overpopulated prisons is obviously something that we hear a lot about. Several states, a huge percentage of their budget goes toward prisons because they're just so overcrowded. So if we could lower prison populations, that money could be spent elsewhere. Recidivism is obviously a huge problem in our country, because so many criminals will just end up right back in prison. And again, this kind of adds to the overcrowded prisons that we already have, when the same prisoners just keep going back time and time again. Number 9 was alternatives to prison sentences, and I'd say the two best to this are parole and probation, which are used but maybe not used as often or as effectively as they could be used. So there's another section that talked about just different ways we could kind of rehabilitate prisoners without having them be in prison. Number 10, the last section, was the mental health of inmates. Research kind of shows that inmates who are incarcerated in severely overcrowded prisons have a tendency to have more mental health issues after their incarceration is over, and that can just kind of lead to recidivism right there, because if they have mental health issues they're not getting treated for like they should be in prison, then it's just kind of adding to the problem, and it's just a continuing cycle. The perspectives, positions, and needs just kind of looks at the different people who are affected by prison overcrowding. And the first one, and probably one of the ones we think about most, would be the prison staff and the guards of the prisons that are overpopulated. It just makes their jobs extremely dangerous when they are having to deal with such huge numbers of prisoners. And then the next was judges. And judges are in a really difficult situation because they have to punish the offenders, obviously, but at the same time they have to keep the overcrowded prisons issue in mind when sentencing prisoners. The next was inmates, and they're obviously affected because they're the ones serving the sentences. And then also with overcrowded prisons, things are a lot more dangerous in there. They have less humane conditions to live in. Number 4 was citizens in the community. They're obviously affected because sometimes when an inmate is released from prison and they served a sentence that they didn't think they deserved to serve, then they will come out with a vengeance, kind of, and sometimes do a much worse and more violent crime than the one that they were initially arrested for. My proposal would be to decrease the amount of prison violence caused by prison overcrowding. Again, it's a known fact that the more overcrowded the prison, the more likelihood of violence occurring in that prison is. So, my proposal would be to increase the quality of training for the prison staff and guards, and to increase the number of prison guards in the overcrowded prisons. This would keep them safe, the guards themselves safer. This would keep the inmates safer, and just make it a less stressful environment for everybody there. My ultimate goal with this would be to decrease the populations of overcrowded prisons. When prisons are overpopulated, the likelihood of violence increases drastically. So if we could better train our guards, they could take care of themselves better in violent situations and also protect the inmates more. But they're so outnumbered by the number of inmates that it's almost an impossible task right now. So not only would my proposal be to increase the amount and the quality of training for prison guards, but it would also be to increase the number of staff required to be in a prison for a certain amount of inmates in that prison. Most correctional guards are just not trained long enough. In many places, they're only trained for 4 weeks before they start their job, and with my proposal, it would be a minimum of 20 weeks. This would help them be better prepared to recognize violent situations that are starting to kind of develop in the prisons. It would also help them know how to defend themselves, defend their other correctional guards, and defend the inmates more effectively. Funding for this proposal would come from taxes. That's where prisons get their funding usually. So I know it's not the most interesting idea, but that would be the most realistic way to make it happen, to either increase or take funds from a different but part of the budget and put it into better training the guards. They would be required to go through 20 weeks, and that would be a lot more expensive of a program. And then also, once they're already employed at the prison, they would have to also be trained 1 week out of a year to just kind of brush up on, new ideas and better ways to handle different situations. It would require them to stay in physical shape. All those tests and everything that they would go through cost money to send them to those different training areas, so that would obviously cost money too. And then also the increased staff. You'd have to have more staff in each prison that was overcrowded, so that would obviously cost money also. That would probably make a lot of people really upset at first, because putting more money into the prison system is exactly opposite of what most people want to do. But once the prison population was lowered, they would actually be spending less on the prison system than we currently are, because a prisoner to be held in a prison for 1 year costs over $30,000. So this would be a plan to better train the staff so they'd be better prepared for violent situations, and then it would also increase the number of staff in that prison. And this would really just cause a sense of urgency to figure out a more effective solution than what we have right now to lowering the prison population. So once the prison population began to lower, which would be the plan of this proposal, then we would actually be spending less money in our prisons, because to house so many prisoners is extremely expensive, especially in states like California, Florida, and Texas, where they spend just ridiculous amounts of money to house prisoners each year. So the increased staff and training would be tested in several violent prisons across the country, and then we would see how effective it was. It would not start nationwide until we saw how effective it was in a few situations, and if it was effective, that's when we would implement it nationwide. The effectiveness of this proposal would be seen by the number of violent incidences before and after the implementation. So if the number of violent incidences was lower after we better trained our staff and increased the number of staff in prisons, we would know if it was effective in that way. The other goal is to ultimately decrease prison overcrowding. So if prison overcrowding was lowered, then we would see that it achieved its second goal. And then here are my references.